The emperor's eyes had been open for 3 days, staring at nothing while flies gathered at the corners. In the villa's marble halls, servants crept on silent feet, each terrified of being the one to confirm what the smell already announced. Outside, beyond Capri's cliffs, a sound began distant at first, like waves against rocks, but growing clearer with each passing hour. Words formed from the roar to the Tiber, with Tiberius. The chant spread from Rome's streets to every corner of the empire. In death, the man who had terrorized millions for 23 years was reduced to what he'd always been: rotting meat. The servants found him twisted in his sheets, face locked in a final grimace, the pustulas that covered his body now weeping their last. No tears fell for Tiberius, only celebration that the nightmare had finally ended. How did a celebrated general who once refused supreme power transform into a creature so vile that Romans invented new words for his depravities? To understand how evil wore the purple, we must return to a wedding day that began with tears. Tiberius pressed his face against the garden wall, watching his ex-wife pass by with her new husband. And for the last time in his life, witnesses saw him weep. The year was 12 BC, and Rome's most promising general had just lost the only person who'd ever loved him truly. Vipania hadn't wanted the divorce, neither had Tiberius. But Augustus commanded, and when the first emperor commanded, even love had to die. The marriage to Vipania had been Tiberius's anchor to humanity. She understood his awkward silences, his preference for military camps over palace halls. Together, they'd built something rare in Roman nobility: genuine affection. Their son Drusus was proof that even the grim Tiberius could create joy. But Augustus had plans that required sacrifice. Augustus needed political alliance. His daughter Julia needed a new husband after Agrippa's death. The solution was obvious: force Tiberius to divorce his beloved wife and marry into direct imperial blood. The orders came wrapped in talk of duty and destiny. Tiberius resisted until resistance became treason. The divorce proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. One day Vipania was his wife. The next she belonged to another senator. Roman law was clean that way. Roman hearts were messier. Servants reported finding Tiberius standing outside Vipania's new home at strange hours. Once he followed her through the forum, maintaining distance but never losing sight. When she finally turned and saw him, witnesses said she ran. He stood frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd. The wedding night would set a pattern of cruelty. Julia was everything Vipania wasn't: sharp where she'd been gentle, cruel where she'd been kind. She'd been forced into this marriage too, but unlike Tiberius, she chose revenge over grief. Their wedding night became a battle. She mocked his stammering attempts at intimacy. He responded with silence that grew darker with each passing day. The marriage bed became a nightly humiliation. Julia took lovers openly, ensuring Tiberius knew every detail. She'd returned from affairs wearing other men's gifts, describing their superiority in intimate matters. Tiberius endured, but something inside him began to twist. Servants noticed the changes first. Where once he'd been merely stern, he became unpredictable. A slave who spilled wine might receive forgiveness or 50 lashes. The decision seemed to depend on whether Tiberius had seen Vipania that day. His famous self-control cracked, revealing something sharp underneath. Military dispatches from this period show a commander growing brutal. Enemies who once received honorable deaths now faced creative punishment. A German chieftain who'd surrendered, expecting mercy, was forced to watch his entire family executed before his own death. The general who'd once inspired loyalty through fairness now ruled through fear. Yet this was only the first soul Tiberius would lose. The transformation accelerated with each passing month. He began drinking heavily, something the obstreperous soldier had never done. Wine made the nights with Julia bearable, but brought darker thoughts. He started keeping lists, names of those who'd wronged him, real or imagined slight recorded with disturbing precision. Physical violence entered the marriage, not the explosive kind that draws attention, but calculated cruelties. Julia's slaves whispered of strange punishments for minor infractions. A hairdresser who pulled too hard found her fingers broken one by one. A cupbearer who served wine too slowly was forced to stand holding full jugs until his arms gave out, then beaten for spilling. Through it all, Tiberius continued his vigils outside Vipania's home. The new husband complained to magistrates, but who would arrest Augustus's son-in-law? The stalking continued, a reminder that power could take everything except obsession. If losing love created a wound, losing blood would pour poison into it, and death was already riding toward his son. The messenger's words hit like a physical blow. "Your son is dead, Caesar. The physicians suspect poison, doses." Julius Caesar had been the only good thing to come from Tiberius's marriage to Julia. Young, charismatic, everything his father wasn't. Dos had been groomed to inherit an empire. At 23 he commanded legions with natural ease. At 23 he died writhing in agony as his organs failed. The death mask captured his final expression. Mouth twisted, eyes bulging. Poison was certain. The poisoner remained a mystery. Tiberius's grief transformed immediately into rage. If love for Vipania had been his anchor to humanity, love for Dosis had been his last thread of sanity. That thread snapped with an almost audible sound, but the death mask revealed something worse than murder. The physicians examined the body with growing alarm. This wasn't common poison. The effects were too precise, too cruel. Someone with extensive knowledge had crafted Dos's death to maximize suffering. The killer wanted him to know he was dying, wanted him to have time to think about it. Tiberius absorbed this information in silence. Those present said his face never changed, but his hands clenched so tightly that blood dripped from where nails pierced palms. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Bring me everyone who had access to my son's food and drink." The investigation began that night. Not the measured Roman justice of trials and evidence, but something older and darker. Tiberius personally questioned each suspect. The questions started reasonable movements, alibis, motivations. Then they became strained. He wanted to know their dreams, their childhood fears, whether they believed in afterlife punishment. The list of suspects grew daily. With Tiberius's own hand, a wine steward who'd served at Duce's final meal, the physician who'd failed to save him, a senator who'd argued with Duces about grain distribution, Julius's freed woman who'd been seen near the kitchens. The list expanded beyond logic. Anyone who'd benefited from Duces's death, anyone who'd ever opposed him, anyone who'd simply been present. Tiberius created categories: certain guilt, probable guilt, possible guilt, guilt by association. The executions began with the first category, but didn't stop there. Roman law required evidence, but grief required blood, and Tiberius had discovered which need was stronger. The wine steward died first crucifixion, but modified. Tiberius ordered the crossbeam lowered just enough that the man's toes could touch ground, extending the agony for days. The physician received poison, but diluted to recreate Drus's slow death. Each execution was tailored, personalized, a signature of calculated vengeance. What he did to the physician's family would become his template. The physician had a wife and 3 children. Roman law said families weren't responsible for individual crimes. Tiberius found creative interpretations. The wife was charged with failing to report her husband's suspicious behavior, a capital offense if proven. The eldest son, barely 16, was accused of conspiracy by silence. The 2 younger children presented a legal problem. Roman law forbade executing children under puberty. Tiberius consulted ancient precedents until he found obscure references to corruption of blood, the idea that treason poisoned entire bloodline. He ordered the children held until they came of age, then executed for inherited guilt. But waiting proved intolerable. Each day the children lived felt like mockery of Duces's death. Tiberius found another solution. If they couldn't be executed as children, they need not remain children. He ordered forced ceremonies, declaring them adults, then had them strangled the same day. The pattern was established. Future victims would learn that Tiberius's revenge extended beyond individuals to everyone they'd ever loved. Guilt by blood, by marriage, by friendship, by mere proximity. The empire watched in horror as grief metastasized into systematic cruelty. Within months, Tiberius made a decision that would transform an empire into a prison. He was leaving Rome forever. The architect's hands trembled as Tiberius explained exactly what kinds of rooms the 12 villas would need. Capri had been chosen with disturbing care, an island fortress accessible only by sea with cliffs that dropped straight into deep water. No surprises could reach him there. No assassins could approach unseen. More importantly, no witnesses could easily escape. The architect, a Syrian named Kellers, had built palaces across the empire. Nothing in his experience prepared him for Tiberius's specifications. 12 villas, each with a different purpose. Hidden passages between them, rooms with drains in the floors, pools of varying depths with viewing platforms above, chambers with hooks in the ceilings, and restraints built into walls. "I require privacy," Tiberius explained, his ruined face half hidden in shadow. Complete privacy. Villa number 3 had pools unlike any in Rome. The pools weren't for swimming. Their dimensions were precise, deep enough that an adult couldn't touch bottom, shallow enough that activities within remained visible from above. Heating systems kept the water at specific temperature. Underwater seating was carved into the sides at calculated heights. Kellers asked no questions. He'd learned that curiosity around Tiberius led to disappearance. He built what was requested, and tried not to think about purposes. His workers recruited from across the empire, to prevent any single group from knowing the full plan, completed their sections, and were immediately shipped away. Other villas served different functions. Villa 7 contained small chambers, each soundproofed with thick walls and cork lining. Villa 9 had medical facilities that seemed excessive for a private residence, examination tables with restraints, collections of surgical tools, containers for storing various fluids. The ships arrived at night, their cargo making no sound. The first vessels brought supplies and servants. The servants were peculiar choices, young, attractive, selected for qualities beyond typical household skills. They came from distant provinces, places where Latin was barely spoken, where families wouldn't ask questions about children who never returned. Later ships brought different cargo, wrapped bundles that moved occasionally, crates with air holes. Guards accompanied these shipments, men who'd served in the German campaigns, and learned to follow orders without thought. The construction took 2 years. By the time Kellers finished, Capri had become a self-contained world, answerable only to Tiberius. Supply lines were established. Food, wine, and other necessities arrived weekly. What left the island was mostly correspondence, imperial edicts that grew stranger and crueler with each passing month. But architecture was only the beginning of his innovation. Tiberius assembled a court unlike any in Roman history, where normal emperors surrounded themselves with advisors and administrators. He collected different expertise. There was Charicles, a physician who'd been expelled from Rhodes for unnatural experiments. Nerva, a legal scholar who specialized in finding loopholes in protective law. Acelius, who'd run the empire's most exclusive brothel before accusations of extreme practices forced him underground. These men became Tiberius's inner circle, each contributing specialized knowledge to the emperor's evolving interests. They dined together nightly, conversations ranging from philosophy to depravity with equal intellectual rigor. Visitors reported an atmosphere of scholarly corruption, where unspeakable acts were discussed with the same detachment as grain imports. The court attracted others drawn to darkness, minor nobles who'd been shunned for their appetites, merchants who dealt in specific types of slaves, artists who pistoled in capturing moments of human extremity. Capri became a magnet for the empire's worst impulses, all protected by imperial authority. When the first screams echoed across Capri's cliffs, even the guards who thought they'd seen everything in Germania's wars learned they were wrong. The slave's job posting was unlike any seen in Roman markets. Seeking swimming instructors for imperial pools, children preferred. The recruitment happened quietly across the empire's poorest districts. Families with too many mouths to feed were approached by well-dressed intermediaries. The offer seemed generous. Their children would serve in the emperor's household, learning valuable skills while sending money home. Parents who asked too many questions found the offers withdrawn. Those who agreed never saw their children again. The selected children, mostly between 6 and 10 years old, were transported to Capri in covered wagons and closed ships. They arrived confused, but hopeful. Many had never seen the sea before, never imagined such luxury existed. The villa's marble halls and laden tables seemed like dreams made real. The training began with simple swimming lessons, but the pool instructors were patient at first. Children needed to be comfortable in water, to associate it with play rather than fear. They learned to hold their breath, to move gracefully beneath the surface, to swim between adult legs without breaking rhythm. Rewards came for those who learned quickly: sweet treats, soft beds, promises of eventual wealth. Gradually, the lessons became specific. Children were taught to nibble gently, like the small fish that cleaned larger ones in natural pools. They practiced on fruits first, then on each other under careful supervision. Those who bit too hard were punished. Those who showed reluctance were punished worse. The name minnows emerged naturally. Like schools of tiny fish, the children learned to move together, responding to subtle signals. A hand gesture meant approach. A different gesture meant retreat. They developed their own communication glances and touches that warned of moods, dangers, opportunities. Parents who asked about their children received only silence. Letters home stopped after the first month. Official responses to inquiries were vague. The children were well. Training continued. Further contact would disrupt their adjustment. Parents who persisted found themselves facing other troubles. Tax assessments increased. Business licenses were revoked. The message was clear without being stated. Some parents attempted to reach Capri themselves. None made it past the mainland ports. Those who insisted too loudly simply disappeared, their names added to the growing lists of those who opposed the emperor's will. The remaining families learned to grieve in silence, to speak of their lost children in past tense. On Capri, the children's transformation continued with mechanical precision. They were given new names, sea creatures mostly, identities that erased their past. They lived together in dormitories attached to the pool complexes, their lives structured around training schedules and performance requirements. One boy tried to escape by diving deep, not knowing. The pools had been designed with escape in mind, not to facilitate it, but to prevent it. The boy named Octopus, formerly Marcus from Bendisium, thought he could hold his breath long enough to swim through the underwater passages. He didn't know they led nowhere, that the apparent exits were visual tricks, created by clever architecture. They found him hours later, lungs full of water, still clawing at solid stone he believed was freedom. Tiberius ordered the body displayed to the other minnows as education. The lesson was simple. There was no escape except through complete submission. Even death required permission. The psychological conditioning intensified after each escape attempt. Children were taught that their families had sold them, that the outside world had rejected them, that only Tiberius's mercy kept them from worse fate. They learned to be grateful for their positions, to compete for approval, to inform on each other's doubts. But pools were only one venue for horror. Tiberius had discovered that fear itself could be weaponized across an empire. Marcus Culvus had been poor yesterday. Today, after whispering 5 words to a magistrate, he owned his neighbor's villa. The 5 words were, he cursed the emperor's name. Whether true or not mattered less than the accusation itself. Under Tiberius's new laws, speaking against the emperor was treason. Hearing such speech without reporting it was complicity. Suspecting such thoughts without investigating was negligence. The entire empire became a web of potential guilt. The The delator system transformed Roman society within months. Professional informers emerged from every social class: bankrupted, merchant, seeking fresh starts, ambitious freedmen craving citizenship, senators eliminating rivals. Information became currency more valuable than gold, and everyone had something to sell. Marcus Culvus was typical of the new breed, a failed pottery merchant. He discovered his talent for remembering conversations, inflecting innocent words with sinister meanings. His first success came accidentally reporting a customer's complaint about taxes as seditious speech. The customer's execution brought Marcus a percentage of confiscated property. The formula was simple: accusation plus execution equals profit. The mathematics of terror were publicly posted. Successful informers received 1/4 of convicted traitors' estates. In cases of extreme wealth, even that fraction could establish dynasties. The imperial treasury took another quarter, funding further investigations. The remaining half went to public works, making every citizen complicit in the system's rewards. Competition among delator grew fierce. Simple accusations no longer sufficed. Evidence was manufactured. Conversations invented, documents forged with increasing sophistication. Informers hired actors to befriend targets, extracting compromising statements through carefully orchestrated scenarios. The most successful developed specialties. One focused on interpreting dreams as treasonous prophecies. Another analyzed facial expressions during public readings of imperial edicts. A third claimed ability to detect seditious thoughts through pulse examination. The absurdity mattered less than results, and results meant execution. Children learned to listen at keyholes, knowing words were worth gold. The corruption of youth became perhaps the system's greatest horror. Parents taught children to memorize dinner conversations, to report unusual phrases or suspicious silence. Schools incorporated loyalty lessons where students practiced identifying treasonous statements in hypothetical scenarios. Families shattered from within. Brothers denounced brothers for inheritance shares. Wives accused husbands to escape unhappy marriages. Children promised rewards and protection, testified against parents who disciplined them too harshly. The psychological damage spread like plague. Trust became impossible when any confidence could become evidence. Friendships withered as social interaction carried lethal risk. Even thoughts felt dangerous, as if Tiberius's agents could read minds through careful observation of behavior. But some accusations required more than words as proof. Physical evidence carried more weight in tribunals, leading to increasingly creative fabrication. Letters were forged with expertise that would impress modern criminals. Witnessed meetings were staged using doubles and disguises. Innocent objects, a rusted sword, foreign coins, lists of names were planted to suggest conspiracy. One delator, Fulcinius, perfected the art of retroactive treason. He would identify recently deceased citizens, then discover evidence of their lifetime conspiracies. The dead couldn't defend themselves, and their estates were forfeit regardless. Families lost everything to accusations against ghosts. The system fed itself through terror's mathematics. More accusations meant more executions, which meant more property to distribute, which attracted more informers. Tiberius encouraged the cycle, seeing it as perfect governance, the empire policing itself while funding its operations through confiscation. When the law itself became an instrument of torture, Tiberius's magistrates discovered how to make execution an art form that began long before death. The scribe dipped his pen and wrote the new procedure. Virgin executions require preliminary action to ensure legal compliance. Ancient Roman law contained a protection even Tiberius initially couldn't circumvent. Virgins couldn't be executed. The prohibition stretched back to the Republic's founding, rooted in religious beliefs about purity and divine justice. For a ruler determined to eliminate entire bloodlines, this presented an unacceptable obstacle. The solution emerged during the prosecution of Caenus's family. His young daughter, barely 12, was condemned for her father's treason. When magistrates balked at executing a virgin child, Tiberius's legal advisors found precedent in military law. Enemies of Rome forfeited all protections, including those of innocence. The executioner received specific instruction before the strangling could proceed legally. The girl's virgin status had to be eliminated. What followed established a pattern that would haunt Roman justice for generations. The law was satisfied through atrocity, technical compliance achieved through acts that mocked justice itself. The law books grew thick with new interpretations. Tiberius's legal scholars worked tirelessly to close every loophole that might allow mercy. Age restrictions were reinterpreted. If someone could walk and speak, they could commit treason. Mental capacity exemptions. Vanished madness became evidence of divine punishment for hidden crimes. Particularly creative was the expansion of guilt by association. Traditional Roman law held individuals responsible for their own actions. Under Tiberius, responsibility became contagious. Slaves were executed for masters' crimes. Dinner guests were condemned for not denouncing treasonous table talk. Physicians faced death for treating accused traitors. The concept of constructive treason emerged, acts innocent in themselves, but potentially leading to sedition. Astrologers predicting imperial deaths even centuries future were executed for encouraging patience among conspirators. Historians writing about past tyrannicides were killed for providing instruction manuals. Magistrates competed to find creative applications. The judicial system became a grotesque tournament of innovation. Judge Vibius Soranus pioneered preventive execution, killing those who might commit future crimes based on personality assessment. Judge Catumalinus developed inherited intent, children inheriting not just parents' guilt but their presumed motivations. Torture traditionally limited to extracting confessions became standard procedure for witnesses. The logic was perverse but consistent. Only pain could overcome natural reluctance to betray friends. Those who confessed quickly were suspected of prepared lies. Those who resisted were guilty of concealment. Every response justified escalation. Legal proceedings became theatrical performances. Accusers hired orators to embellish charges with emotional appeals. Evidence was presented in order of ascending horror, building to crescendos that made verdicts inevitable. Defenders, when allowed, faced execution themselves for too vigorous representation of clients. One judge's innovation would haunt families for generations. Judge Macro introduced sequential justice, executing family members in order of increasing emotional attachment. Distant relatives died first. Their deaths used to pressure closer relations into confession. Parents watched children die to protect spouses, then were executed anyway for the original crime, plus the additional charge of allowing family members to die in their place. The records of these proceedings preserved in imperial archives read like manuals of sadism, wrapped in legal language. Each innovation was carefully documented, creating precedent for future use. What began as exceptional measures became standard practice, encoded in law that outlived its creator. The bureaucratization of cruelty required vast administrative machinery. Clerks specialized in tracking bloodlines to ensure no relations escaped. Archives stored detailed records of associations who dined with whom, who married, whose cousins who shared business ventures. The information network supporting legal atrocities grew more sophisticated than any modern surveillance state. But the worst tortures weren't physical. Tiberius had learned to murder hope itself, turning mercy into the cruelest weapon. The prisoner collapsed with relief when the reprieve was announced, not knowing he'd just entered the worst part of his ordeal. Lucius Orontius had spent 6 months in the Mamertine prison, awaiting execution for imagined conspiracy. The cell's darkness had become familiar, its rats almost companionable, compared to human visitors. When guards announced Tiberius's clemency, charges dropped. Freedom granted, Lucius wept with joy he'd thought forever lost. The sunlight hurt after months of darkness. Rome's streets seemed impossibly loud, impossibly bright. His wife collapsed when he appeared at their door, ghost pale and skeletal but alive. The children he'd assumed he'd never see again clung to his legs. For 3 perfect days, life resumed its rhythms. On the fourth morning, soldiers returned. New evidence had emerged. The clemency was revoked. As they dragged Lucius back to prison, his wife's screams echoed those of countless others who'd learned Tiberius's favorite game. 3 days of freedom were worth more pain than 3 years of prison. The psychological torture of false mercy exceeded physical pain through precision. Prisoners were studied to determine what they valued most. Family reunions, favorite foods, simple sunlight, reprieves were crafted to restore exactly these elements before snatching them away. The contrast multiplied suffering exponentially. Some prisoners received multiple reprieves. The record holder, a senator named Gacilius, was freed and rearrested 7 times over 2 years. Each release was perfectly timed, just long enough to believe the nightmare had ended, too short to truly heal. His final execution came as relief to everyone, including himself. The system's cruelty lay in its unpredictability. Some reprieves lasted hours, others months. Prisoners never knew if freedom was real, or another turn in Tiberius's game. They couldn't fully embrace joy, couldn't fully surrender to despair. They existed in perpetual emotional twilight. Some prisoners begged for death before their second reprieve. Marcus Lepidus tried to hang himself rather than face another cycle. Guards cut him down, nursed him to health, then announced his next temporary freedom. He spent it in catatonic terror, unable to speak or move, waiting for the inevitable reverse. When it came, witnesses said he smiled for the first time in years. The reprieves destroyed families as effectively as executions. Wives who'd mourned husbands had to unmourn them, then mourn again. Children grew confused about whether father was alive or dead, afraid to love someone who might disappear again. The emotional whiplash created generational trauma. Even worse were conditional reprieves. Your freedom depends on your brother's confession. You live as long as your son remains loyal. Prisoners were released into webs of impossible requirements, knowing any moment might bring their recall. They became unwilling agents of their own torture. The system was so effective that other emperors took note. Tiberius documented his methods with disturbing pride. Letters to governors explained optimal timing for maximum psychological impact. Charts tracked emotional breaking points across different personality types. The science of false mercy became another Roman innovation exported across the empire. Some prisoners developed immunity through madness. They greeted each reprieve with indifference, each air rest with equal calm. These broken souls frustrated. Tiberius' suffering required awareness, and madness provided escape. He ordered physicians to maintain prisoners' sanity through careful treatment, preserving their capacity for pain. The false mercy system created its own economy. Families paid fortunes for information about reprieve schedules. Guards sold hints about duration. A black market emerged in emotional preparation. Philosophers who taught techniques for surviving. Hope's murder. Physicians who prescribed herbs to numb anticipation. As minds shattered across the empire, Tiberius's own body began reflecting the rot within, and mirrors became his newest enemy. The physician recoiled as pustules burst under his touch, the emperor's face weeping pus that no ointment could stop. The physical decay had begun subtly, a persistent rash, occasional boils, skin that wouldn't heal properly. Court physicians initially blamed diet, stress, the island's humid air. They prescribed treatments that worked on normal men. But Tiberius had long ceased being normal, and his body seemed determined to make that truth visible. By his 70th year, the corruption was undeniable. Open sores covered his face and scalp, weeping constantly despite every medical intervention. The smell preceded him through the villa's rotting meat, mixed with failed attempts at perfumed concealment. Servants learned to breathe through their mouths in his presence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who declared himself a god was decomposing while still alive. Priests who'd been forced to worship his divine nature now struggled not to vomit during ceremonies. The contrast between imperial propaganda and physical reality became Rome's darkest joke. Each new saw seemed to birth fresh cruelty. The correlation between physical decay and moral degradation was too obvious to ignore. As Tiberius's body failed, his mind compensated with increasingly elaborate tortures. Days when the sores were worse saw the most execution. Physicians tracked flare-ups like weather patterns, warning staff when eruptions predicted violence. He banned mirrors throughout Capri after catching his own reflection. The polished bronze showed truth too clearly divine. Augustus's successor reduced to a walking pestilence. Servants who accidentally revealed reflective surfaces were flogged. One woman died for wearing jewelry that showed his image too clearly. The medical consultations became surreal performance. Physicians examined the emperor while avoiding direct sight, diagnosing through peripheral vision and cautious touch. They prescribed treatments they knew wouldn't work, knowing honesty meant death. The charade satisfied no one but continued because alternative was worse. Servants who glimpsed his face often disappeared. The household staff developed elaborate protocols to avoid seeing their master directly. They walked backwards when serving, kept eyes fixed on floors, wore special hoods that limited vision. Even accidental glimpses carried risk. A maid who gasped at unexpected sight was strangled within hours. Tiberius's paranoia about appearance extended beyond vanity. He believed enemies might use his image in cursed tablets, that accurate portraits could channel magical attacks. Artists were forbidden from depicting him. Coins showed decades-old profiles. The empire was ruled by a phantom of past glory, while present horror went unrecorded. The physical suffering increased his cruelty exponentially. Unable to sleep from pain, he ordered entertainment through others' agony. Night executions became common, screams drowning out his own groan. He experimented with whether different types of suffering might ease his own, treating human pain as medicine. The smell preceded him like a herald of doom. Even outdoors, the stench announced Tiberius's approach minutes before appearance. Gardens wilted in his presence. Whether from reality or servants' fearful imagination remained unclear. Animals fled. The sea breeze that should have cleansed Capri's air seemed to intensify the corruption. Attempts at concealment grew desperate. Incense burners preceded imperial processions, creating smoke screens. Perfumes were mixed in quantities that burned eyes and throats. The cure became another affliction, as courtiers choked on remedies worse than the original problem. The decay spread metaphorically through the court. Those closest to Tiberius developed their own ailments: rashes, boils, mysterious wasting diseases. Whether contagion or divine judgment, proximity to corruption carried visible cost. The inner circle became a collection of walking wounds. But even as his body failed, Tiberius perfected one final innovation, turning Capri's cliffs into Rome's most terrifying execution ground. The soldier stationed at the cliff's base had requested the position, thinking it would be easy duty, until the first body crashed down. Centurion Marcus Flavius had served 20 years in the legions, surviving Germanic forests and Parthian deserts. He thought Capri would be retirement, sun, simple guard duties. The recruitment officer hadn't mentioned the cliff or what his actual responsibilities would entail. The location was perfect for its purpose. A sheer drop of 300 feet onto jagged rocks, with deep water beyond to carry away remains. No trial needed, no formal execution staging, just a push in gravity. Tiberius had discovered efficiency in geography, turning nature itself into an execution. Marcus's duty was simple in description, horrific in practice. Wait at the base with a special hooked club. Ensure no one survived the fall. Sometimes they did, broken but breathing, begging for mercy that couldn't be granted. His orders were specific: complete what gravity began. Some victims tried to jump before being pushed, but the cliff's edge was carefully managed. Guards were trained to read body language, to spot the moment when despair turned to desperate action. They would surge forward, restraining victims who sought to control their final moment. Even the choice of when to die was denied. The forced marches to the cliff became ceremonies of terror. Victims were made to walk slowly to contemplate the approaching edge. Some were told they were being taken to boats for exile, maintaining hope until the final turn revealed truth. Others knew from the first step their knowing, making the journey worse. Groups were often executed together. Families suspected conspirator rings, sometimes random selections to fill quotas. They were made to watch each proceed, counting down their own approaching turns. Children saw parents fall. Husbands watched wives pushed. The psychological multiplication of suffering was intentional. The rocks below became stained, permanently red. No amount of tides could cleanse what accumulated below. The stones took on rusty hues that persisted through seasons. Fishermen avoided the waters, claiming nets came up tangled with horrors. Birds that fed there were considered cursed, their meat tainted by what they'd consumed. Marcus Flavius kept his own tally at first, making small marks on his shield. After the hunduffed body, he stopped counting but couldn't stop remembering. Faces haunted him. The young woman who smiled before jumping. The old man who cursed gods that didn't save him. The child who called for mother while falling. The cliff executions served multiple purposes beyond simple killing. They were visible from the sea, warning approaching vessels about Capri's nature. The screams carried across water on quiet nights, reaching mainland towns as reminders of imperial power. Even distance provided no escape from awareness. One soldier kept count until the number broke him. Legionnaire Quintus had a head for figures, took pride in precision. He maintained detailed records, names when known, descriptions when not, times of day, weather conditions, last words spoken. His logs became compulsively complete, as if documentation might provide meaning to meaninglessness. By his count, 8,447 people went over the cliff in his first year. The number broke something in his mind. He began seeing them while awake, falling eternally, never hitting bottom. His bunkmates reported him speaking to empty air, apologizing to invisible accusers. One morning they found him at cliff's base, having joined his careful tally. The cliff duty rotated after that. No soldier serving more than a month. Even that proved too long for some. Veterans of brutal campaigns broke under the weight of executing civilians. The passive nature of the killing, just standing and waiting for gravity's work, somehow made it worse than combat's active violence. 23 years of accumulated horror had poisoned the empire, so thoroughly that Romans began praying for something they'd never wanted before, the emperor's death. In hushed taverns across the empire, citizens whispered the same desperate question: is the monster finally dying? By 36 AD, death rumors had become Rome's favorite entertainment. Every cough reported from Capri sparked hope. Every delayed message suggested possibilities. Markets fluctuated with health reports. Grain prices dropped when Tiberius seemed weak, soared when he recovered. The empire's economy had become tied to one man's mortality. The prayers were universal, but carefully hid temples saw increased offerings to gods of death, though petitioners claimed other purposes. Cursed tablets were buried at crossroads, their lid surfaces scratched with pleas for imperial demise. Even hatred had to be expressed in code when walls had ears. Previous assassination attempts had failed spectacularly. Each failure brought waves of executions. Not just conspirators, but anyone who'd shown insufficient horror at the attempts. Celebrating survival became mandatory performance. Citizens practiced shocked expressions in mirrors, preparing for news of the next failed plot. But each death rumor proved false, followed by purges. The pattern was predictable as sunrise. Rumors of illness would circulate for days, growing more detailed with each telling. Hope would build to dangerous levels. Then Tiberius would appear very much alive, very much aware of who'd celebrated prematurely. Lists of names would follow, then arrests, then executions. One particularly cruel episode involved false announcement of his death by a corrupt messenger. Celebrations erupted before confirmation. When Tiberius emerged, he let festivities continue for 3 days before revealing himself. The subsequent purge eliminated hundreds who'd shown joy too openly. The messenger's entire family tree was pruned to the root. The emotional exhaustion wore down even the strongest. Hope became another form of torture when repeatedly raised and crushed. Some Romans developed protective pessimism, refusing to believe any positive news. Others cracked under the strain of perpetual performance, unable to maintain required grief at his continued survival. Some Romans fled rather than risk another decade. Voluntary exile increased dramatically in Tiberius's final year. Entire families liquidated holdings and disappeared to frontier provinces. They preferred barbarian neighbors to civilized terror. Border towns swelled with refugees who chose uncertainty over the certainty of eventual accusation. Those who couldn't flee developed survival strategies. Conversations became masterpieces of ambiguity. Every statement carefully constructed to avoid interpretation as criticism. Public spaces emptied as social interaction carried lethal risk. Rome became a city of shadows and silence. The informer network adapted to immigration patterns. Delatory specialized in tracking fleeing families, following gold movements and property transfers. Leaving itself became evidence of guilt. The empire's borders became trap lines, catching those who sought escape from the inescapable. Then came March 37 AD, and this time the silence from Capri was real. The first sign was disrupted routine. Supply ships returned without collecting new orders. Messages to the island went unanswered. The careful clockwork of imperial administration ground to halt. For once, silence might mean what everyone hoped. Still, no one dared celebrate. Previous false alarms had taught fatal lessons. Days passed in suspended animation. Business slowed as Romans waited for confirmation. Even informers hesitated to report treasonous joy when joy itself might be premature. The confirmation came obliquely. Funeral preparations beginning in Rome before official announcement. Someone was dead on Capri. Someone important enough for state ceremony. Hope crystallized into possibility. Possibility into probability. Still, public reaction remained muted. 2 decades of terror had trained away spontaneous emotion. On the morning of March 16th, a servant crept into the emperor's chamber and discovered what millions had prayed for. But was the nightmare truly over? The servant's sandals whispered against marble as he approached the emperor's bed. 3 days of silence had built courage enough for investigation. The smell hit first corruption beneath perfume. Death's calling card that no incense could match. Tiberius lay twisted in silk sheets, eyes fixed on some ceiling horror only he could see. Flies walked across those unblinking orbs, their buzzing the only sound in the room that had echoed with screams. The face that had terrorized an empire was now just meat. Pustules still weeping their poison into fabric that would be burned rather than cleaned. The servant backed away slowly, as if the corpse might still pronounce judgment. In the hallway he met others creeping forward with similar intent. They exchanged glances, confirmation without words. One ran for the captain of guards. Another rushed to prepare signal fires. The rest stood frozen, uncertain how to process the reality of the monster's mortality. Word spread through Capri's villas like flame through oil. Servants who'd walked in shadows for years stepped into sunlight. Guards set down weapons they'd used for atrocities. In the pools where horrors had unfolded, someone began draining the water as if evil could be flushed away. On the mainland, sharp eyes noticed the signal fires. "He's dead," someone whispered. "The emperor is dead." The whisper became murmur. Murmur became shout. Shout became raw. 23 years of suppressed emotion erupted simultaneously across the empire to the Tiber with Tiberius. The chant began in Rome's poorest quarters where his victims had been most numerous. It spread through markets and forums, gathering voices like avalanche gathering snow. Senators who'd cowered for decades suddenly discovered courage in crowds. Citizens who'd informed on neighbors embraced in mutual forgiveness. The spontaneous festivals that erupted defied description. Wine flowed freely as tavern owners declared imperial death worth bankruptcy. Musicians played songs forbidden for decades. Dancers performed in streets that had seen only funeral processions. Rome laughed and cried and screamed its relief. But even in celebration, damage was evident. Children who'd grown up under terror didn't understand the joy. Adults flinched from happiness, expecting reversal. 2 decades of conditioning couldn't be undone by one corpse. The empire was free, but scarred, liberated, but forever changed. Officials debated furiously over the body's fate. Traditional ceremony demanded state funeral, divine honors for the deceased emperor. But tradition hadn't anticipated Tiberius. Senators who'd voted him honors while living now argued for disposal like common criminal. The debate raged while the corpse rotted. The crowd's demand grew louder to the Tiber with Tiberius. Historical precedent existed. Enemies of Rome had been dragged through streets and thrown into the river. But never an emperor, never one who'd been declared divine. The contradiction paralyzed government while mob rule filled the vacuum. On Capri, darker discoveries emerged. The pools gave up their secrets, small bones that told wordless stories. Hidden rooms revealed instruments of specialized purpose. Archives contained lists of victims stretching across decades, names crossed out with mechanical precision. The island itself seemed poisoned as if evil had seeped into stone. Survivors began emerging from hidden places. Children who'd been minnows, now young adults, blinked in sunlight they'd forgotten existed. Women kept for purposes none would specify, walked free on legs that barely remembered how. Each survival story added fresh horror to Tiberius's legacy. The legal system faced impossible questions. How to prosecute the dead, how to compensate victims of imperial decree, how to dismantle machinery of terror without becoming terror itself. Every institution bore corruption's fingerprints. Every lawbook contained his precedent. Some argued for forgetting burning records, abandoning Capri, pretending the decades hadn't happened. Others demanded documentation, insisting horror must be remembered to prevent repetition. The debate would continue through generations, each finding different answers. In the end, pragmatism prevailed over symbolism. Tiberius received minimal rites, his ashes interred quietly while Rome looked away. The Tiber flowed undisturbed, denied the symbolic cleansing crowds had demanded. Perhaps they understood what water couldn't wash away the stain of normalized atrocity. The minnows were freed, but never free, carrying memories that pools of time couldn't dilute. Families reunited with ghosts of children they'd lost. Informers reinvented themselves, though neighbors remembered. The architecture of terror was dismantled, but its foundations remained in Roman law, waiting for future tyrants to build upon. Capri was abandoned to wind and gull. The villas crumbled, their specialized rooms filling with sand and silence. Fishermen claimed the island was cursed, that screams still echoed on certain nights. Whether true or not, the stories kept visitors away. Some ground was too poisoned for reclamation. History would remember Tiberius as the emperor who'd perverted power into patterns previously unimagined. But perhaps the greater horror was how easily Rome had adapted, how quickly atrocity became administrative routine. The capacity for evil hadn't died with him. It had merely lost its most enthusiastic practitioner. Future emperors would study his methods, some with revulsion, others with interest. The precedents he'd set, legal torture, systematic terror, industrialized cruelty, would echo through centuries. Rome had learned what was possible when power met pathology. That knowledge couldn't be unlearned. In the dying light of March 16th, as celebrations finally exhausted themselves, Rome faced an uncomfortable truth. They'd survived Tiberius, but survival had required adaptations that couldn't be easily abandoned. The empire was free, But freedom tastes different after decades of fear. The Tiber flowed on, carrying detritus of daily life as it always had. No corpse polluted its water. No dramatic gesture marked evil's end. Just the slow work of recovery, the careful rebuilding of trust, the hope that future tyrants might be recognized and stopped before they could transform competent generals into creatures of nightmare. But somewhere in the empire, a young Caligula was taking notes, learning from his predecessor's successes and failures. The monster was dead, but monstrosity had proven itself viable. Rome would face that lesson again and again, until empire itself became history's warning about P's corruption. The servant who discovered Tiberius's corpse never spoke of what he'd seen in those dead eyes. Some suggested fear, others surprise. Most agreed on emptiness. Perhaps in the end that was Tiberius's truest punishment, dying as he'd lived alone with the horror of what he'd become, finally forced to see himself without mirrors or mercy.